Hello, folks. How are you? Thank you very, very much. Please. It's an honor to be with you. It's a great honor. Thank you. Thank you very much. Please. Thank you so much. Chad, thank you for that overly generous introduction. But I must tell you, I appreciate it. Sounded awful good. As that old joke goes, my mother is here. She wondered who you were talking about. My father would have believed it. To members of the Human Rights Campaign Board, and to a great, great friend and one of the best friends we've ever had, Michael Berman, and Michael's here as well. It's good to see him earlier. And Chad, thank you for inviting me to be with you again. And thanks for being my friend. You know, as you spoke, I was reminded, and I had to make sure I double-checked to get it exactly right. There's a famous quote by Justice Justice Holmes. And he said, "The mind of a bigot is like the pupil of the eye. The more light you pour on it, the more tightly it will contract." We're never going to be able to, I want you to understand, you're never going to be able to eliminate the bigots. They're a small percentage of the population. They'll continue to be vocal. But make one thing absolutely clear here, folks. They are in an incredibly smaller and smaller minority. This country is changing. It is changing. It doesn't mean we should not and must not confront them everywhere they raise their ugly heads. But I'm optimistic. When I stood before you in Los Angeles, I was optimistic. I'm even more optimistic today than I was then about fully securing the rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender communities. And the reason why I'm optimistic is because of the courage of the people in this room, and so many more of you all across America. Like you, I am constantly confronted and approached by mostly fathers and mothers who will come up to me and lean in and say, "Thank you, thank you. My son, my daughter, my brother, my sister is gay or lesbian or transgender." People are beginning, you have done more to liberate straight folks. Not a joke, not a joke, not a joke. Than you can possibly imagine. You know, I think it's, I was talking with Bruce Bastian in the back, and Bruce said, you know, this is really all about human rights writ large and about being one country and one people. And I said, Bruce, that's what I thought about on the way over here, what I planned on talking about. I think it's particularly poignant that we're talking about how far we've come and how much further we have to go on the eve of the 50th anniversary of the march that a young man named John Lewis organized to lead them folks, over 600 people, over the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. And at that moment, 50 years ago, the vast majority of states still had anti-sodomy laws. Not a single state recognized marriage, and there were so many other impediments beyond the ones that still remain in the path of everyone in this room and the people you fight for. But the same basic human rights were at stake when John marched over that bridge. He said last month, you cannot talk about breaking down barriers between the races without having equality for everybody, including based on gender and sexual orientation. I remember where I was, because I'm slightly older than most of you, 50 years ago. And I remember where both those issues stood 50 years ago. The LGBT community's rights and the rights of African Americans. I was in college, and I was aware. I came from a state that was segregated by law, And I was involved in, as best I could, the civil rights movement at the time. And as Chad knows, I was raised by a very decent, gentle man, my dad, who didn't have a prejudiced bone in his body. He believed that all of God's children, and we're all God's children, were entitled to be treated with dignity and with respect. I remember telling Chad the story about how my father would subtly introduce me to and my siblings to these notions that there should be no discrimination. I remember vividly, I was trying to get a job, the best paying jobs at the time, although I lived in the suburbs, were in the city park system and the city pool systems, the swimming pools in the community. And my dad was driving me down on his way to work to drop me off at the city hall to pick up an application to work in one of those city park systems. Prices Run, it's called, in the middle of the projects. And as I was about to get out of the car, I remember it vividly. There were two men standing in the corner. We were stopped at the light. And as the light stopped us and was green for them to cross, they kissed one another and went at their different directions. And I remember looking quizzically at my dad. My dad just simply said, "Joey, they love one another. They love one another." The reason he was dropping me off was to see if I could get that job. As it turned out, I became the only white employee in the largest park system in the city. I think there were a total of 19 of us as a lifeguard. And it was from my friends that I worked there for several years that I learned the pain of discrimination and hatred. How their dads, they'd talk about going to visit their grandmoms down in South Carolina or Georgia or Southern Virginia, and how they had to carry extra jerry cans of gasoline in the trunk of their car, carry enough food so that they would not have to stop because they knew what they'd be greeted if they stopped along the way. And like so many of my generation, the civil rights movement, which is actually the human rights movement, captured my passion and my commitment. And I was optimistic then. But truth be told, there was no way I could have imagined standing before all of you today as Vice President of the United States, serving with the first African-American president in history. It was beyond anyone's comprehension then. There was no way that I would have told you I'd be standing before you where a Supreme Court had long since declared that anti-sodomy laws were unconstitutional, where gays and lesbians proudly serve in the military, where attacking someone because of their gender identity is considered a hate crime, and where 37 states recognize marriage equality. How'd this happen? How did it happen? Well, it happened because of the courage of so many of you and so many who went before you. My mother, God love her, used to have an expression she repeated many times to her 4 children. And I mean this sincerely. She'd say, "Remember, Joey, you're defined by your courage and you're redeemed by your loyalty. You're defined by your courage and you're redeemed by your loyalty." Where there's courage, passion, and commitment, there's opportunity. Where there's a willingness to directly confront prejudice, bigotry, homophobia, there's the ability to succeed. Because I believe after all these years, at their base, at their root, the American people want to do the right thing. Most of them, till now, have been afraid. They don't fully understand. But as you've had the courage to risk your jobs, some of you your lives, your well-being, you've made it clear to the American people who you are. You are us. You are no different. We are all the same, all entitled to basic, fundamental human rights. But not everybody possessed the courage of John Lewis or Dr. King or Harvey Milk or Barbara Giddings or Miss Major or Judy Shepard. It takes leaders. It takes someone to step forward and to turn adversity into positive change. If you've ever had the opportunity to walk over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, as I did 2 years ago, where I had the opportunity to speak, I can tell you what it looks like. You can't see the other side until you reach the crest. And as this time John Lewis and I and many others walked across the bridge on the 48th anniversary, I was struck by what it must have been like as I reached the crest of the bridge. Because I still have the images, like all my generation does, of what was on the downside of that bridge, where 600 men, women, and children reached that crest with no place to turn back 50 years ago. Uniformed troopers in gas masks, billy clubs, cattle prods, squad cars, mobs of angry faces at the bottom of the bridge, not the top of the bridge, and no place to go. But these folks had the courage to link arms and walk into the jaws of hell. They had no illusions about what they were going to be confronted with. None. 4 years later, the Stonewall Inn must have felt like hell as well, as police armed with nightclubs stormed into the dim and crowded room, blocking the exits and violently arresting the patrons, as they had done so many times before. But this time it was different. This time the decision was made: we've had enough. We've had enough. And for 7 days, Christopher Street became alive with the demand for dignity and respect that continues to echo around the world now, from the steps of the Supreme Court to the streets of Moscow to the villages of Uganda. And although the events of Selma and Stonewall were separate movements, they were in fact the same movement. They're in fact the same basic movement. After all, it was a gay man named Bayard Rustin who taught Dr. King the principles of nonviolence and organized the March on Washington to bring Dr. King's dream to the world. He was, in his own words, an angelic troublemaker. An angelic troublemaker. Well, so are you. So are you. And thank God you are. You were repeatedly told, and your predecessors repeatedly told, when in the early days of the civil rights movement as a kid, we were told, be patient, be patient, remain silent. But as Harvey Milk said, hope will never be silent. It sounds good. But at that time and even now, to raise your voice, to break the silence, takes courage. And in some places, it still is dangerous. But none of you are silent. And that's why my children and my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren are going to live in a totally different country and a different world, because you've decided to not remain silent, not be thankful for anything that you're already entitled to. We now live in a nation where an African-American president is leading that march over the bridge tomorrow. In a nation where 224 million Americans in 37 states now live where same-sex marriage is legal. To put this, To put this in perspective, when I spoke out on Meet the Press back in May in 2012, it made me very popular, didn't it? I told the president I wasn't going to change my brand. But at that time, nothing to do with me, just a date and point in time, there were only 6 states in America where marriage equality was recognized. When we spoke last, Chad, and Chad and I spoke after I spoke, we've spoken a number of times, but Chad and I had a conference call about 8 months ago where he said, what we need to do now, Mr. President, is we need to focus on the South, because there are just as many LGBT constituents in the South as are anywhere else in the whole United States of America. And we're given the opportunity to see the truth. The people in the South will do what the rest of the country is beginning to do. Embrace them. Deal with the injustice. Respond. Today, South Carolina, Florida, Alabama. This didn't happen because of me. This didn't happen because of anything anyone in government said. It happened because you insisted. Your unrelenting determination to make the case that basic human rights are entitled to be recognized everywhere in the world, not just in the United States. Granted, we've come a great distance, and we still have much further to go. But folks, we're over the bridge. It's a different place. The momentum is undeniably on our side and is not capable of being slowed. It is not capable of being stopped. Dr. King talked about the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Well, by your vocal, consistent, unrelenting call for justice, we're bending it faster than it otherwise would be. We would have never gotten here but for the courage that you and all the one before you exhibited. Not just moral courage, but physical courage. But even though we've come so far, so fast, as Chad spoke to, there's still so much more we have to do. But it is a different place. It is a different time. Look at the polling data, not just what's happening in the States. As the American people become aware, they become embracive. We have to pass the federal non-discrimination legislation, and we need to pass it now. We need to pass it now. I apologize for my voice. I have a bad cold, but let me just put it in this context. 8, 10 years ago, even 2 years ago, homophobic statements would have been, if not embraced, not viewed as having generated any political liability. Look what's happening even in, quote, the other party today. Seriously. Don't misread the political trends in history here. Now, every ridiculous assertion from Dr. Carson on, I mean, Jesus, God. Oh, God. I mean, it's kind of hard to fathom, isn't it? But think about the universal ridicule. That wouldn't have happened 2 years ago, 5 years ago. It matters. It matters. It shocks the conscience that at this moment in America history, 29 states in America, people are denied basic dignity because of who they are or who they love. But this is not the trend. We live in a country where 15,000 LGBT youth are homeless, largely because their families don't accept them for the way they are. Nearly 1 in 5 transgender people have been homeless at some point in their lives, kicked out or refused housing because of their identity. And in our schools, LGBT students are twice as likely to be pushed or kicked or mocked or laughed at and seen as different. But look what's happening in those schools as well. Other students spontaneously beginning to reach out. Organizations are being put in place. Teachers are beginning to speak up. We're not there yet. But I don't want you walking out of here thinking that arc is bending the wrong way. It is bending rapidly. But without a good job, without a decent place to live, without a shot of a decent education, it's very hard to make it today. And we have to continue to fight until everyone in this country, regardless of race, gender, religion, identity, orientation, has a fair shot at crossing that bridge all the way to the other side. That's the legacy of Selma. That's the challenge of Stonewall. And this is the work that remains for all of us to be done. It's my honor. It's my honor, and it really is an honor to link arms with you and so many other people who continue that march. Think how many more straight folks are linking arms with you than ever did before. I said, you know, societal change comes slowly for a long time, and then and no one can ever predict when it occurs. It just picks up a momentum and a steam that is, if you think about it historically, is predictable, but at the moment is not very predictable. Think about how much has changed in the straight community in the last several years. Those of you, and many of you are very successful businessmen and women. If 5 years ago you were in a fancy restaurant in Washington, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, any major city, and you went from the hedge fund you work with or the company you work with, and you went to lunch with your colleagues, and a waiter walked up and he had a pronounced lisp. And one of the people at this table said, well, I'll tell you what I'll have. Everybody at the rest of that table would have remained silent. Today, the rest of that table is empowered to speak up and say, you horse's tail. What the hell's the matter with you? Think about it. Think about it. That's a greater insight into how rapidly things are changing, in my view, than almost anything else. I always kid Chad when we speak and others that every time I'd walk out of my grandfather Finnegan's home, he'd yell, Joey, keep the faith. But I want you to remember what my grandmother would say. She'd say, no, Joey, go spread it. Spread the faith, folks. We are going to fully, totally, thoroughly succeed. It's inevitable because of you. Thank you all so very much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.